Hello everybody, I'm Tosca Bruno-van Vijfeijken and I'm an organizational development, change management and leadership development advisor. I've worked with and in international as well as to some extent domestic nonprofits for about 30 years, including in some that have worked on human service delivery. In this video, I'm going to share some high-level concepts and principles linked to how to lead and manage organizational change processes, such as, in your case, the introduction of trauma-informed approaches and ultimately organizational cultures, but also policies, organizational systems, and processes that support trauma-informed approaches. Change management obviously is a huge field of practice. So please understand I'm only going to introduce a couple of key concepts. So they pertain to 5 topics. 1, the role of communication in leading and managing organizational change. 2, what to focus on when you want to create momentum and motivation for organizational change. 3, the psychology of change, the all-important people factors in organizational change. 4, talk a little bit with you about culture change, organizational culture change. And 5, how you might measure and track the extent to which such change is actually happening. I will end with a brief recap, and I will leave you then with some questions for reflection and for discussion as you have your meetings after you've viewed this video. So let's go. So the first topic I want to talk to you is about communication. Senior leaders of human service nonprofit agencies always tell me, communicate, communicate, communicate. They have found that you will always under-communicate in proportion to what your staff, your volunteers, and your patients need. The second aspect of communication is that it's important to communicate in multiple ways and through multiple channels. In multiple ways, by that I mean that some people in your agencies, they need the big picture. They need to be energized, they need to be inspired, they need to be able to see the vision of the future. What will my agency look like when we have really embedded trauma-informed approaches in our whole organizational identity? Other people, they need something very differently. They need to know, what will it mean for me next week, for myself, my job, my future, for my team, for my department? What does it mean for the access that I will have either to clients or to my boss, access to influence budgets? What does it mean for my power or prestige within the organization? Second dimension of this is that it's really important to use multiple channels. So using not just written information, emails, memos, etc., but also face-to-face meetings to create trust and bonding and understanding. Use videos, use all kinds of mechanisms and materials and messaging channels to get your message across. And it's very clear it's very important in your communication to be clear to your staff and your clients and volunteers. Is this trauma-informed approaches strategy, is that on top of other things that we were already doing? Is it going to be instead of? And what will we be letting go? So those were a couple of things about communication. Now I would like to turn with you to the issue of how to create momentum and motivation amongst your staff, your volunteers, your boards, and your clients. So John Kotter at Harvard, this is a classic kind of change management model, and it has been critiqued to some extent, but some of the core elements I feel are still important. And that is, a lot of change leaders and change managers think that we need to start with the big vision first. But actually, the research tells us that we have to first build a sense of urgency amongst our boards, our staff, our volunteers, and our clients around this transition to trauma-informed approaches. The why, the purpose, and sometimes what will happen if we do not do this. The second thing is it's important for us to build a change coalition, change ambassadors. Who is with you in this drive towards more trauma-informed approaches? Whose interests and incentives are aligned with that direction? And whose incentives and incentive systems would argue against this change journey? And be really intentional about pulling together a change coalition is really important. After that, it's important to build that vision. But think about that, creating and strengthening that sense of urgency first, and building that change coalition. Another important element, according to Cotter, is that we have to remove obstacles, as well as empowering staff and volunteers and patients to implement a change journey and to create short-term wins in that process. And of course, modeling changes in behaviors and habits, which I'll come back to when I talk about culture, by you as leaders and managers is incredibly important. The second component I wanted to talk about is the psychology of change. William Bridges talks about this. He talks about the 3 phases of change and transition from a point of view of people's psychology. So we have the ending phase, and I'll explain what that is. We have the uncomfortable in-between phase, and then we have the new beginnings phase. So in the ending phase, we need to make sure that we understand as change managers and change leaders that our people, our staff, our volunteers, etc., they first have to leave the old approaches behind, the non-trauma informed approaches. And you've all heard and read about resistance to change, right? Some people would argue that people don't like change. That is not necessarily the case, the research would say, but certainly we need to fully be aware of the sense of loss that people can have. There can be loss of control, introduction of uncertainty, so loss of certainty, loss of familiarity, loss of a sense of competence, very important. A change can mean more work for me. And there can be a real sense of threat, such as a loss of a job, of a budget, of a team, of my authority, of access to top leaders, and even political power inside the agency. So it's incredibly important psychologically that we honor the past. We honor the approaches that your agencies used in the past, because to honor that sense of loss gives people a sense of respect. And sometimes staff are actually attached to some of the intangible values that were embedded in the old approaches. So what we want to avoid at all costs is giving staff or volunteers or patients a sense that what they contributed in the past is no longer of value. Because that is a profound sense of loss, and that can lead to grieving that you're trying to avoid as much as possible. So in that ending phase, it's important to identify frankly and honestly who's losing what, to accept the fact that staff may be fairly subjective in their reactions at first and may even overreact. We have to acknowledge those losses openly and sympathetically as change leaders and managers. We have to accept and expect that there will be signs of grieving. We have to compensate for those losses as much as possible. And we have to give people information over and over again. So we have to manage that ending with respect, and if possible with small ceremonies, with little rituals, with openly acknowledging that. And we have to make sure that our staff understand that by ending something, they are contributing to the beginning of an even more impactful agency. So we have to sell the problem, if you will. Then we have that in-between zone, that neutral zone, as Bridget calls it, and it can be quite uncomfortable because a lot of the old approaches are being gradually phased out, but the new beginning is not yet in place. This uncomfortable in-between phase, however, also means your agencies are ripe for innovation at that point in time. So we have to take advantage of that window for innovation. And then we get to the new beginning. And we have to manage and mark this, right? We have to communicate once again the purpose, the why behind the change. And we have to help our staff and volunteers visualize the outcome. What will happen? How will our agencies be more impactful when we are trauma informed? We have to define each person's role in that new outcome. We have to use symbols, narrative, storytelling to mark the new beginning. And we have to celebrate early successes. Now, something I wanted to talk to briefly is about the psychological contract. You all know what it means to have a legal contract, a formal contract. You may well have heard about social contracts between staff or volunteers and nonprofits, which is this sense of unspoken rules around how do I dress when I go to the office, right? How do I speak? What do I joke about and what do I not joke about? Well, there's also the psychological contract. And this is the often unspoken belief system that I find in quite a few nonprofits, that if I do a decent job, if I care about the cause and the clients, and if I'm willing to work long hours for relatively modest income, then I will have a job for life. And that unspoken belief system can become quite problematic if we have to enact changes in our agencies that do involve, for instance, changes in staff. So we have to really be careful that we manage those unspoken expectations carefully. Okay, the fourth thing I want to talk about is culture change. So culture is obviously, is often many change leaders and managers think it's a fairly squishy topic, difficult to get your hands around. But actually, I like to pull it down by saying that it's a set of daily practiced, widely shared, and constantly replicated habits and behaviors that are constantly rewarded or incentivized. And often, yes, those habits and behaviors are informed by unspoken belief systems about what is right in my agency, or how we work around here. That's culture. So we need to pull the concept of culture down from kind of lofty values and principles, which we may be very attached to, but that may or may not influence the actual habits and behaviors that are constantly rewarded in an organization. So you may ask yourself, now, how do I change culture? How do I affect it? In a nutshell, you start by affirming and holding on to those aspects of the existing culture that's already in place that actually can support your shift in direction towards trauma-informed approaches that are already aligned. This is really, really important because, again, it honors for staff that what they did in the past was and continues to be valuable and will continue to be a foundation for the future. The second thing I would recommend is that you focus on introducing and rewarding only 2 or 3 new habits or behaviors at any one time, because we know from the neuroscience that human beings can only hold 2 or 3 priorities at any one time. So if you want to introduce more habits or behaviors, you need to sequence that out a little bit. Obviously, you as change leaders and change managers need to model the changes and the behaviors and the habits that you want to see more of. You have to hold up and celebrate those new habits and behaviors that you want to see more of. And I mean that not just formally by award ceremonies, by promoting certain people, etc., but also importantly on a day-to-day basis, informally, such as deferring to certain people who you feel are an embodiment of a trauma-informed approach person. Holding them up in a meeting, celebrating them in public, even very informally, is very, very important, because your staff are watching what you do much more than what you say. I would recommend you use storytelling again, and images and symbols and rituals that communicate the principles behind trauma-informed approaches and the habits that you want to see more of. And you have to, conversely, disincentivize those habits and behaviors that are no longer aligned with trauma-informed approaches, and hold people accountable for that. And that includes within your senior leadership teams. I would recommend you make use of change champions, of culture ambassadors, so people who are already naturally imbuing their work with the trauma-informed approaches. Because if you use people with a lot of informal influence in the organization, they may not have a lot of positional power, but they may have a lot of informal influence. Other people will want to emulate them and will start copying their behavior, and that's how culture change can go viral. And of course, you have to back up those new behaviors and habits into organizational systems and processes. So in your recruitment, your promotion, your development of people, your performance management, etc. Because you need to make sure that your organizational systems and processes are actually reinforcing these new habits and behaviors that you want to see more of, and that you remove the friction for staff to engage in them. Otherwise, staff may well revert back to old behaviors. And then fifth, I want to talk to you briefly about how one way you could measure and track to what extent your agencies are moving towards a trauma-informed approach and culture. And that is the use of frequent pulse or micro-surveys to gauge whether your people and your culture are moving in that direction. And some examples of potential statements you could put forth to your people through regular micro-surveys is such as, I feel encouraged and supported to align my actions with trauma-informed approaches. I feel safe in advancing trauma-informed approaches, even if it results in short-term costs to the organizations. My organization rewards staff and actions and behaviors that align with this new pathway. My organization does not tolerate actions and behaviors that do not align with trauma-informed approaches. And my organization celebrates such habits and behaviors. So those are the kind of questions or statements you could put forth in pulse surveys to track whether your culture change is on its way. So to recap, finally, I talked with you about 1, the role of communication in organizational change, leadership and management. 2, what to focus on when you want to create motivation or momentum for change in your agencies. 3, the psychology of organizational change, these all important people factors. 4, culture change. And 5, how you might measure and track the extent to which culture change is starting to happen. Overall, I would want to close by saying that it's my experience that any organizational change process typically takes longer than you as change leaders and managers would wish for. It will always cost more time and money than you had expected, and the desired results tend to come later than what you had hoped for. So this means it requires patience, stamina, and diligence and consistency to stick with it. Culture change in particular takes a long time. culture is tenacious because it worked for your agencies for a long time in the past. So don't underestimate how long that may take. So I have 3 takeaway questions for you to grapple with in your meetings if you're interested. 1, what is one thing that you think you will differently as a change leader, as a change manager, in introducing and sustaining trauma-informed approaches? 2, what questions are emerging for you now? And 3 is, how would you complete the following statement? When all is said and done, as a change leader, I want to ... I'd love for you to finish that sentence for yourself and to discuss it in your meetings. I will leave you at that. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I wish you the very best in implementing trauma-informed approaches and cultures in your agencies. Thank you.